So, what happens in PTSD? And I'm really excited about this video because I think there's so much information that's going to help us understand PTSD and with it be able to do something about it. So, without any further ado, the most important thing about this involves PTSD and memory. And the takeaway line is memory in PTSD is very, very different from the way that memory operates normally. What usually happens in memory is we have the time and the space, and most importantly, the security to be able to pay attention and concentration on the information we're receiving. If these factors are in place, then we're able to process the information which we're taking in. And what seems to be the important part of processing is that we add a time tag to that information. That time tag then is stored in our memory or simply forgotten. There's a lot of information there, so let's break this down with a diagram. And what I've tried to represent as our perception, the things we see, the things we hear, the things we smell, is with that eye at the top of the diagram. And I'm going to say more about parts of the brain later, but above that eye I've got the word cortex. And that's the evolved, modern, human brain, and that's where we're seeing things from. So we've got the security for our human brain, our evolved brain, our cortex to be working, and that's going to do the processing. And so it's offering, with the safety it feels, that large perceptual arc with which it's then receiving that information. Information comes in, it's seen, a time tag is offered to it. That's why I've got the date there then. And that time tag then moves into memory. Or, as we do with lots of stuff, it's simply forgotten. This is what happens when memory is working normally, usually. So let's experiment with this and bring to mind any non-trauma memory. There's stuff that most of us remember, be it our first day at school, or the first day in our job, or the first time that we moved into a flat on our own or with a partner, our first child and their birth, whatever it might be, bring that to mind as a non-trauma memory. And usually, most people would say that there's something about that memory that feels like it's in the past. And that is the time tag in action. So it actually feels like it's there, it feels like it's being processed, it feels like it's in the past. Now, trauma memory is very different from this. And in a trauma, in a situation where our life is threatened or the life around us is threatened, the animal brain takes over. And one of the things that our animal brain does is sharpen our perception, is focus the things we're seeing, listening to, concentrating on, to the most vital things, like the threats, the exits, or just whatever makes a situation more bearable. Now, because it does that, we can only have a time tag with those things that we've paid attention to. Yet there's plenty of other things in that situation, and those other things don't get a time tag. Let's put this to diagram again. So we've got our eye up there, representing perception, representing those things that we're concentrating on. And as the animal brain has taken over, it's now narrowed. And it's paid attention and given that time tag to those things which are most vital in that situation. Other information passes through without that time tag. And this is what flashbacks, nightmares, trauma nightmares, or intrusive memories which feel like we're back there are. They're the remembering of a memory without a time tag. And when we remember them, the animal brain activates again. It thinks it's happening all over again. It does what it's meant to, which is generate lots of agitation, generate a fight and flight response to help get us out of it. That is a deeply bodily memory, and so with it other senses activate. Smells might be present, sights might be present, hearing might be present. So this is the really vital thing about what happens with these re-experiencing symptoms in trauma. So that's memory, and let's fit that into a cognitive behavioural model of trauma. And this is the work of Ehlers and Clark. And as we can see, from a trauma event, I'll talk more about that in another video, we develop a memory which is very, very different to other memories. It's an unprocessed memory. And actually we develop beliefs about what happens. This goes on to inform that hypervigilance, that anger, that fear, that threat in the here and now, which we have to cope with, an aspect of which will be avoidance. And the means by which we cope with it, unfortunately, tend to reinforce the memory and the meaning involved, or the belief involved, I should say. So let's talk about belief. It's also perhaps helpful to say this is where we can know or experience things on two levels which reflect those two parts of the brain, the cortex and the animal brain. I remember reading a newspaper article once about a woman who'd been really seriously sexually assaulted, and she reported feelings of disbelief and horror that she became frightened of her brother and father, two people with whom she'd had really, really good relationships. Now what was happening here was that something about the nature of the trauma meant that she was being reminded of the man who attacked her against those two loving figures. Her cortex, the mature human brain, knew that her brother and father were perfectly nice, reasonable people. Her animal brain was activating to the reminder, and that unprocessed memory, that memory without a time tag, was coming back and interfering with her conceptions in the there and now. So that's how we can know or experience things on two different levels which feel like a contradiction in trauma. Belief is the meaning we attribute to what's happened or ourselves or other people in the trauma and beyond it. It's the sense we make, how we interpret the trauma itself, ourselves within it, the world afterwards, and potentially our future. I've mentioned one particular belief about the symptoms of trauma already. Am I going mad? That's the meaning we ascribe to what's happening for us, and is one particular example. Other examples regard worthlessness. I feel worthless that this has happened. I feel weak. I couldn't protect myself. I was out of control. Might be about other people. Other people are threatening. Other people have bad intentions. That might inform our sense of the world. The world is an unsafe place. The world is a hostile place. These are all examples of some of the typical interpretations, appraisals, thoughts which come about from trauma, the kind of meaning we ascribe to ourselves and what's happened. Now, having generated these beliefs, we're in a situation where we're likely to be affected by them. If I believe I am worthless that this trauma has happened, that's an appraisal that may lend itself to sadness, feelings of loss, feelings of grief. If I believe that other people are untrustworthy or have bad intentions about me, then this might lend itself to feelings of anxiety about what's happened. I might also feel very angry that a trauma has befallen me. And all of these things lend themselves to this next bit, this sense of threat. This sense of threat is also going to be added to by the fact that we have unprocessed memories, which are going to be offering flashbacks, intrusive memories, nightmares and sleep disturbance. So where we're at right now with that anxiety and that fear and that anger is a really difficult place to be at. And so invariably we cope somehow. And at some level this usually involves a degree of avoidance. Some of this cannot be helped, some of this isn't conscious. We can no more control waking up from a trauma nightmare than we can control digesting a sandwich if we were to swallow it. There are many different ways of coping, almost as infinite as we are people, but some of the major ones might involve withdrawal, so actually protecting ourselves within our houses or around our friends and family. Drugs and alcohol may feature, self-harm might feature, becoming aggressive might feature, and I seem to notice that with people who are combat trained or experienced in being able to handle themselves physically. And this might not feel like a form of avoidance. However, in a kind of a way, it's almost like those people are protecting themselves and avoiding the idea that the world might be safer than they assume it is. Often, avoidance also involves reminders themselves, so we would steer clear of people who might remind us of perpetrators in the situation, or remind ourselves of particularly significant witnesses. Especially, we might avoid where it happened, or sites and circumstances which remind us of where it happened. We may furthermore go on to avoid thoughts or feelings that remind us of the ones that we encountered in the trauma. Let's finish off with an example. Let's follow this model through, and I'm going to try and choose an example which is not going to activate you if you're watching today, something that's sufficiently random. So let's say I'm walking through the park and I'm attacked by an escaped tiger from the zoo. And very, very luckily, due to the intervention of other people, I survived that attack. That's our trauma. It's highly plausible. With such a vicious animal, I would assume that I was going to die. It becomes an unprocessed memory. So actually the circumstances in which that happened were sufficient for me not to be able to pay attention or concentration to all of the aspects, just the most important and threatening ones. And I develop flashbacks and nightmares as a result. This comes to inform the fear and the hurt of that situation. But because it's such an unusual situation, I also develop a belief about the trauma that actually we're not safe wherever we go. This could happen at any time. Doesn't matter how rare it is, that we're just no longer ever safe. And indeed, that's something which lends itself to feeling very anxious and threatened. Those are the feelings that I'm dealing with alongside my flashbacks and my nightmares. How do I cope with this? Well, I cope with this by avoidance. So I decide that I stay in my home. I stay in my flat. Now, because I'm staying in my flat, I'm not offering myself the opportunity to go down the park again or go anywhere else and discover that this doesn't happen. So I'm not creating the opportunity of forming different memories. And if I stay in my flat, the chances are that my life is going to become very limited. Friends will probably only have a certain degree of patience before they start to give up on me. My workplace is certainly only going to take it for so long that I don't turn up into work. And indeed, if this carries on, this is going to start to inform my beliefs about myself. Now I don't have any friends and I don't have work. My future is starting to look pretty bleak, isn't it? And if I don't have friends, if I don't have work, I might start to assume that I'm pretty no good as a person. And indeed that other people are not sympathetic, or other people are not willing to give me the time, and that then comes to inform a sense of sadness, a sense of threat, a sense of anxiety about my circumstances. So carrying more weight of how this has developed, I have to up the ante. I have to do something which gets rid of even these feelings. Let's say I start self-harming, and this removes the upset of these temporarily. I dissociate. I make concrete the hurt I'm suffering with the physical mark. Now, whilst it gets rid of it for a time, it's not going to get rid of it forever. The situation doesn't change. So I have to continue to do that. Maybe I feel stuck doing it. Oftentimes when people self-harm, they feel ashamed afterwards. Maybe this builds upon my sense of worthlessness, my sense of not being good enough. And maybe this maintains the threats, the anxiety, the fear, the sadness I'm suffering in the here and now. And indeed, I have to resort to other means or up the ante. Maybe I will think about then ending my life because it feels there's no way out of this trap. Of course, not all people who suffer trauma go through quite the withdrawal I'm describing. It may very well be that you have it for more specific things, and indeed you haven't resorted to some of the things I've described. Why I come to this case and why I use that example is to illustrate how, through some avoidance, our difficulties might double or multiply, and indeed we may, not necessarily, resort to other means of coping that only deepen that distress. Why I really wanted to get this out is because this is a theorised part of post-traumatic stress disorder that it feels to me like not a lot of people know about, and it's a really nice explanation for exactly what goes on. I hear in my practice so many people say, am I going mad that I'm remembering these things and I'm remembering them so vividly? No. It's just the nature of memory in these circumstances. It's just the way our animal brain tries to protect us all over again with a memory that doesn't operate the way other memories do. So if you do have PTSD, if you are suffering from trauma-like symptoms, this might be a way of actually normalising your experiences. This is a normal response to really, really difficult situations that have happened. I also hear, why can't I just get over it? And that's because getting over it is very different to other things that we have to get over. It's not simply a case of reconciling the kinds of things we think about a situation or accepting what's happened. That's a degree of it, but actually getting over post-traumatic stress disorder is about this memory without a time tag. And it's by telling the story, it's about processing it. It's often about going through it or forging different experiences, which means that this rogue toxic memory which keeps coming back is processed, a time tag is added to it, and it's kind of put in its place with lots of different other memories. That happens very differently, and so getting over it looks very different. It's not like getting over it with other things. I really hope that this has been a helpful introduction to the Ehlers and Clark model, and with its understanding we're able to recognise that trauma is a normal response to an abnormal situation. Next up, we're going to think about the biology of trauma, what happens in the brain in the different regions I've mentioned already. And let's, as we find out about those, use those understandings to be able to cope with trauma symptoms and find a way of getting on with our lives with them. And if you have liked this video, please like and subscribe to Beacon Psychology Service.